Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
He didn't stop caring about her, he just started acting like someone who didn't. And the strange part is she could feel both versions of him at the same time. The one who reached for her, and the one who was already halfway gone before she even said goodbye. It didn't feel like anything important at first. That's the part one keep coming back to. Because when people talk about connections like this, they usually describe a moment where everything changes all at once. A spark, a sign, a clear before and after line you can point to. But this wasn't like that. This was quieter, almost forgettable in real time. He met her in a way that didn't feel cinematic. No dramatic introduction, no instant recognition, just a normal sequence of events that could have gone in any direction and probably would have if he had been a slightly different version of himself that day. She said something simple, he responded. She laughed at something he didn't expect to be funny, and somewhere in that ordinary exchange, something shifted, but not in a way he could name. It just stayed with him longer than it should have. Not emotionally, not yet. More like a faint awareness, like when you leave a room and realize later you forgot something, but you're not sure what it was. That kind of feeling. He didn't think about her afterward in any serious way, not in the I should see her again sense, more like brief interruptions, random flashes. Her expression when she was listening, the way she tilted her head slightly before responding, things that didn't feel meaningful enough to hold onto, but also didn't disappear completely. He would catch himself remembering small details at strange times. Standing in line somewhere, sitting in traffic, watching his hands and suddenly realizing he could still hear her laugh in his head for no reason at all. And his immediate reaction wasn't curiosity. It was dismissal. Like, no, that's nothing. Just a moment, just coincidence, just a brain doing random things. He had other things to think about. He always had other things to think about. But the thing about nothing is that it doesn't usually ask for attention. It just stays, quietly, waiting for the mind to slow down enough to notice it still exists. The first time they talked again after that initial meeting, he remembers something very specific that feels almost embarrassing in hindsight. He checked his phone more than once before replying, not because he cared in a conscious way, but because something about her message made him pause in a way he didn't want to admit. It wasn't even a complicated message, just something normal, easy to respond to. But he typed a reply, stopped halfway, deleted it, locked the phone, unlocked it again 10 minutes later like nothing had happened. At the time, he would have said he was just busy, or distracted, or not in the mood to text. But the truth was messier than that. There was a slight hesitation he couldn't justify, a small friction between intention and action, like his mind said replying normally. But something underneath it slowed him down without asking permission. And that already bothered him, even if he didn't fully realize why. Because it didn't fit into his usual internal structure. He liked things that made sense. He liked emotional clarity more than he admitted. But this didn't feel clear. It felt slightly off-center. And so he ignored it. That became the pattern early on. Not rejection, not pursuit, just ignoring the small signals that didn't fit anywhere. There was another moment that doesn't seem significant on paper, but stayed in his body longer than expected. He saw her laugh in a group setting, not directed at him, not meaningful in any obvious way, just a natural reaction to something someone else said. But his attention caught on it anyway, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the lack of performance in it. And for a split second, this is the part he wouldn't say out loud, even to himself later. He felt something like stillness. Not attraction exactly, not admiration either, Just a moment where his mind went slightly quiet without permission. And then, almost immediately, he corrected himself internally. That's stupid. It wasn't stupid in a harsh way, more like uncomfortable, because stillness in him usually meant something was about to be felt. And feeling, in the way he was used to avoiding, always came with consequences. So he moved on from it quickly. He shifted back into the role he knew how to play, normal, present, slightly detached. The version of him that doesn't lean in too far. The version that doesn't give anything room to grow. But what he didn't notice at the time was how often his attention started drifting back to her without instruction. Not in big emotional waves. Just micro moments. Seeing something funny and thinking she would have reacted differently. Walking past something and wondering if she would have noticed it too. Opening his phone for something unrelated and pausing for half a second before realizing he was about to search her name without meaning to. Then stopping. That small internal interruption became familiar, almost routine. And still, he labeled it as nothing. That word again. Nothing. He would later realize how often nothing was doing all the emotional work he didn't want to name. There was also a physical part of it that didn't make sense to him yet. A subtle shift in how his body reacted when she was near. Not nervous exactly. Not excited in a clear way. Just more aware. Like his system was registering her presence before his thoughts caught up. He'd notice himself standing a little differently when she was around, or speaking slightly more carefully, or becoming oddly aware of pauses in conversation that normally wouldn't matter. And afterward, when he was alone again, he'd feel a faint drop in energy he couldn't explain. Not sadness, not relief, something in between. Like his body had been slightly engaged in something his mind refused to categorize. But again, he didn't interpret it. He didn't ask what it meant. He just continued. Because that's what he was used to doing when something didn't fit cleanly into his understanding of himself. Ignore it until it becomes irrelevant. That was the assumption. There's a small, almost mundane moment I keep thinking about when I try to reconstruct this part. He was driving once, late afternoon light coming through the windshield, music playing low enough that it wasn't really being listened to. And out of nowhere, he remembered her voice saying one sentence from earlier. Not something important, just a throwaway comment. But it arrived so clearly in his mind that he actually glanced at the passenger seat like someone might be there. And then he laughed a little to himself. Not because it was funny, because it felt slightly absurd that his brain was doing that without permission. He turned the music up after that. Not consciously as avoidance, just instinctively filling space. That's something I notice now when I look back at it. How quickly he filled space. With sound, with distraction, with movement, with anything that kept things from becoming still enough to be noticed. And still, underneath all of it, something was forming. Not a decision. Not a realization. More like accumulation. Tiny moments stacking without being labeled. Until later, when it would become impossible to pretend it wasn't there anymore. But in this first chapter, he didn't know that yet. In this first chapter, he still believed nothing was happening. And maybe that's the most honest part of it. Not that he didn't feel anything, but that he felt it in such small, unremarkable fragments that he could still afford to ignore it. Until he couldn't. At some point, it stops being random. That's the part he doesn't notice right away. Because in the beginning, he still tells himself it's nothing special, just coincidence, just passing thoughts, just a name that shows up too often in his head for no real reason. But then something shifts quietly, almost invisibly. It becomes repetition. And repetition has a way of making things harder to dismiss. He starts noticing her in ways he didn't plan to. Not in a dramatic sense. Not in a she's everything I think about kind of way. It's more subtle than that, and somehow more invasive because of it. He'll be doing something completely ordinary, scrolling, working, half listening to someone talking, and her name will appear in his awareness like a background process he didn't open. And the strangest part is not that she appears. It's how fast he recognizes the pattern. He begins to anticipate it. That's where it changes. Because now it's not just memory. It's expectation. He checks his phone more often than he admits. But even that word checks feels too intentional. Sometimes he just picks it up without knowing why. Unlocks it, stares, locks it again. Nothing there. But the motion itself becomes familiar. Like muscle memory forming around something he refuses to name. There's a specific moment I keep hearing when I try to reconstruct his internal state. He's sitting somewhere, doesn't matter where, and he opens a message thread with her name at the top. He doesn't type anything, just looks, then scrolls slightly, then closes it. It takes maybe 15 seconds. But something in that 15 seconds lingers longer than it should. Because it wasn't action. It was hesitation made visible. And hesitation, when repeated, starts to feel like emotion even when it hasn't been labeled yet. He doesn't say anything about it to anyone, not even himself in any direct way. Instead, he creates explanations. She's just easy to talk to. That's why she comes to mind. Nothing deeper than that. But the explanations arrive after the feeling, not before it. And that's important. Because his body is already reacting before his mind agrees to interpret it. He starts doing something he doesn't consciously recognize at first. He waits for her responses. Not impatiently, not obsessively. Just there's a difference in the way time feels when a message is out there. A slight tension under the surface. Like something unresolved is sitting in the background of his attention. He'll open her message thread, see that it's read, and feel a small, almost invisible shift in his chest. Not disappointment, not relief, just a change in pressure. And then immediately he tells himself to move on. He gets better at pretending it doesn't matter. But pretending takes energy, and energy has to come from somewhere. There is another layer that builds quietly alongside this. He starts remembering her reactions. Not full conversations, just fragments. The way she paused before answering something. The exact timing of her laugh in a group setting. The slight expression she made when she was thinking but didn't want to interrupt the flow of conversation. These things start showing up at random moments when he's not trying to think about anything related to her. He'll be in the middle of something completely unrelated, answering an email, walking into a store, sitting in silence before sleep, and suddenly there she is. Not as a thought he invited, but as a detail that reappears without permission. And each time it happens, there's a split-second reaction in him that he doesn't fully register yet. A pause, a micro-recognition, then immediate dismissal. Why am I thinking about that? But the question itself becomes part of the pattern, because it assumes control over something that is already happening without his consent. He starts noticing something else too. He notices how often he checks for her presence in spaces before he even admits he's doing it. If he enters a room, part of his awareness scans automatically, not consciously searching. More like orientation, like a system quietly adjusting itself to a known variable. And when she is there, something shifts again. Not externally, internally. A slight tightening in attention, a subtle increase in awareness of his own behavior. He becomes more measured, more aware of how he stands, how he speaks, how he reacts. Not because he's trying to impress her. He wouldn't say that. He would reject that idea immediately if asked. But something in him is responding anyway, and he doesn't know what to do with that fact. So he avoids naming it. There's a moment I want to slow down on because it reveals more than it looks like on the surface. They're in a group setting. Nothing intimate, nothing isolated. Just noise, movement, overlapping conversations. She laughs at something someone says not directed at him, not significant in any obvious way. And yet his attention locks onto it. Not because it's loud, because it feels natural and forced. And for a brief second, his mind goes strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. Like everything else steps back without permission. And then immediately after that moment, something in him reacts against it. A subtle internal correction. Like, no, not spoken, just felt. Because the quiet feels too open, too unstructured. And he's not used to emotional space that doesn't have an exit strategy. So he re-engages, looks away, rejoins conversation, acts normal. But something has already shifted in the background. He doesn't acknowledge it yet, but his attention has started building a map, a pattern, where she appears more often than logic would explain. And he starts comparing moments without meaning to. If she doesn't reply quickly, he notices. If she replies differently than usual, he notices. If she is present, but not engaging with him directly, he notices that too. And each observation is small on its own, almost meaningless. But together they form something he doesn't have language for yet. There's also a contradiction forming inside him that he doesn't confront. He enjoys the interaction when it happens, but he also feels slightly unsettled by how easily it affects him. That contradiction doesn't resolve. It just sits there, and spoken. And contradictions, when left alone long enough, don't disappear. They accumulate pressure. He starts doing something else without realizing it. He begins to delay responses. Not intentionally, not as a strategy, but as a subtle way of regaining control over timing. If she messages him, he sometimes waits before replying, not because he doesn't want to respond, but because immediate response feels like losing something unnamed. And yet, when he does wait too long, he feels another small discomfort, like he's stretching something that shouldn't be stretched. So he adjusts again, a quiet internal balancing act he never describes out loud. One night, he catches himself opening her message thread more times than necessary. Not to reply, just to look. He pauses after the third time, stares at the screen a little longer than before, and there's a thought that almost forms, but doesn't fully arrive. Something like, this is starting to mean more than I'm admitting. But he doesn't finish it. He locks the phone instead, rolls over, tries to sleep, and his mind, finally unoccupied, begins replaying small fragments he didn't choose to revisit. Her voice, her timing, her expressions. Not emotionally charged memories, just details. But now they're repeating. And repetition, once again, is how something becomes unavoidable without ever announcing itself as important. He doesn't know it yet, but this is the point where nothing stops being nothing. Not because something dramatic happened, but because attention, once patterned, rarely goes back to randomness. And somewhere in the background of all his denial and dismissal and controlled distance, he has already started keeping track. It doesn't happen all at once. That's the part he tells himself later when he tries to make sense of it. It's gradual enough that he can still deny it while it's happening. At first, nothing feels wrong, just slightly different. A delay here, a shorter reply there, a message left sitting longer than usual before he answers it. And he has explanations ready before anyone even asks. Busy, tired, work, life. All reasonable words that don't sound like avoidance unless you're paying very close attention. And nobody is paying that close attention. Except him. Even though he pretends he isn't. There's a moment he remembers later. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt like a tiny shift in temperature. She messages him something simple, nothing emotional, nothing demanding. And he sees it. He sees it. But he doesn't reply right away. Not because he's thinking. Not because he's unavailable. Just because. He puts the phone face down, walks away, does something else. It should feel normal. But something in him stays slightly aware of the fact that he didn't reply. Like a small thread left hanging in the background of his attention. Hours pass. Then more hours. And when he finally opens the message again, the moment feels heavier than it should. Not because of what she said, but because of the gap. The space he created without formally deciding to create it. He types something simple, deletes it, rewrites it in a slightly colder tone, then sends it, and immediately locks the phone like he's closing a door he doesn't want to look back at. After that, something subtle changes in how he interacts with her. Not in what he says, but in when he says it. Timing becomes something he starts controlling without fully acknowledging it. If she messages quickly, he delays. If she responds warmly, he becomes slightly more measured. Not consciously. It doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like reflex. Like his system is trying to regain balance without telling him what imbalance even exists. He starts telling himself a familiar sentence. I'm just busy right now. And the sentence works. For a while. Because it explains behavior without requiring emotional honesty. But the body doesn't fully agree. There are moments he catches himself opening her chat thread without intending to. Just a quick check. Then closing it. Then reopening it later. Not to read anything new. Just to confirm it's still there. Still accessible. Still unresolved. He would never describe it like that in his own words. He would say he's just checking something. But the repetition begins to feel less like checking and more like circling. There's also something he doesn't say out loud, even in his own thoughts. He notices her absence more than her presence now. And that shift is what he tries hardest to ignore. Because noticing absence means something has already been defined. He starts to observe himself in a way that feels slightly uncomfortable. For example, why did he feel a small drop in energy when she didn't reply? Why did he recheck his phone after telling himself not to? Why did he feel slightly irritated at nothing specific after seeing her online, but not interacting with him? None of these questions get answered properly. Instead, they get replaced. I'm overthinking. I'm just tired. I shouldn't care this much. But even those sentences carry an emotional admission he doesn't fully recognize yet. There is a specific afternoon he remembers clearly. He's sitting somewhere neutral, nothing important happening around him. Phone in hand. Her message is there. He reads it once, then again, and instead of replying, he puts the phone down and stares at something else entirely. A wall. A window. Something meaningless enough to absorb his attention without asking anything from him. And in that pause, something uncomfortable rises slightly. Not guilt. Not longing. Something closer to friction. Like two impulses existing at the same time and neither one fully winning. One part of him wants to respond immediately. Not for logical reasons. Just for continuity. The other part pulls back. Not because of her. Because of what responding quickly would mean about him. He doesn't articulate that thought clearly. It just exists as pressure. So he chooses delay. And delay becomes the pattern. Later that night, something strange happens. He checks his phone more times than necessary. Not waiting for a message exactly. Just checking. Like, if he looks often enough, he might regain control over the feeling of waiting. At one point, he opens the chat again, scrolls slightly, sees nothing new, and locks the phone immediately. But his mind doesn't lock with it. It keeps running a quiet background process he doesn't fully authorize. There's also a subtle change in how he behaves in public settings with her. He becomes slightly more composed. Not distant in an obvious way, just more careful. Like he is now aware of an invisible measurement happening in real time. How he responds. How long he pauses before answering. How often he initiates conversation. It's not intentional performance. It feels more like self-monitoring, as if a part of him is standing slightly outside the interaction, watching. And that watcher part is becoming more active. There is a moment where she laughs at something he says, or maybe someone else says, and he notices his own reaction after it happens. Not during. After. A small internal check. Did I say that right? Did that sound normal? Why is he even checking? He doesn't know. He just is. And that just is begins to accumulate. He starts to feel something he can't quite name yet. Not anxiety. Not excitement. Something closer to awareness of consequence. Like every interaction now has weight he didn't assign consciously. And that weight makes him slightly slower. More calculated. Less immediate. But the irony is, the more he slows down, the more noticeable the space becomes. She starts to respond differently too. Not in a dramatic way. Just matching the new rhythm. A little less immediate. A little less open-ended. And he notices that too. Of course he does. That's the part he doesn't admit easily. He notices everything. Even when he pretends he doesn't care. There is a night where this becomes clearer than usual. He's lying down, phone in hand. No message from her for a while. And instead of feeling neutral about it, he feels something slightly off. Not sadness. Not relief. Just absence that has become structured enough to notice. He opens the chat once, closes it, opens it again a few minutes later, and halfway through that second check, he pauses. Not because anything changed, but because he realizes what he's doing. And that realization doesn't lead to clarity, it leads to discomfort. So he locks the phone again and turns away. But sleep doesn't come easily, because the mind has already started replaying the pattern. Delay gives check, gives delay, gives check, gives silence, gives awareness, gives denial. And somewhere inside that loop, a quiet truth begins forming without permission. This isn't just busy, but he still doesn't say it out loud. Not yet. Because naming it would mean acknowledging that something is happening between them that can't be controlled just by timing. And he is not ready for that. So he continues calling it busy, even as the pattern becomes unmistakably something else. There's a version of him that doesn't exist in daylight. Not because he's fake during the day, but because the day gives him structure. Nice. Tasks. People. Things that keep him from drifting too far into himself. At night, that structure loosens, and something else quietly takes its place. It usually starts small. He'll be lying there, phone in hand, not really intending anything. Just holding it. Scrolling without seeing. Pausing without knowing why. And then it happens without invitation. Her name appears in his mind. Not as a full thought, more like a fragment surfacing from somewhere deeper than attention. He tries to ignore it at first. He really does. He turns the phone face down, then face up again, and locks it. Locks it. It looks almost meaningless from the outside, But internally, something is shifting. Because at night, there's less resistance, less performance, less need to maintain the version of himself that functions normally. So, thoughts don't get filtered the same way. And what he ignores during the day starts speaking more clearly. He tells himself he's just tired. That's the simplest explanation. Tired minds think strange things. But this doesn't feel like tired thinking. It feels like unfinished thinking. There is a moment I keep coming back to when I try to understand this phase. He opens their chat, not because anything new happened, just because it's there. His thumb hovers for a second over her name, and then he scrolls up slightly. He doesn't read anything specific. He's not even searching for information. It's more like checking emotional weather without admitting it. Is anything still there? Did something change? Has anything shifted without him noticing? And when he sees that nothing has changed, he should feel neutral. But he doesn't. There is a slight tension in his chest he doesn't name. Not disappointment. Not relief. Just awareness of continuity. And continuity, for reasons he doesn't fully understand, feels heavier at night. He closes the chat, but not before reopening it again a minute later. Just to confirm. Just to double-check something that doesn't actually need checking. And then he locks the phone harder than necessary, like that physical action could reset something internal. It doesn't. Instead, it opens a space. And in that space, she shows up more clearly. Not her image exactly. Not memories in a cinematic sense. Just fragments. Her laugh at something simple. The way she paused before answering that one question. The slight change in tone when she was tired, but didn't say she was tired. He doesn't choose these memories. They just arrive, one after another, like his mind is organizing a file he didn't ask it to open. And he lies there thinking, half resisting thinking. There is an internal dialogue that starts forming at this point. It's not clean or poetic. It's messy, interrupted, almost like overheard thoughts. Why am I thinking about her again? You're not. I am. No, you're just bored. But why her? Silence. And then the thought returns anyway. Because the conversation doesn't resolve anything. It just repeats. At some point, he picks up his phone again. Not to message her. Not yet. Just to look. He scrolls through their chat. Stops. Scrolls again. He rereads messages he's already read before. Not because he forgot them, but because repetition creates a strange sense of contact. Like staying close to something without actually reaching it. And then something slightly uncomfortable happens. He notices the timing of his own behavior. It's late. Too late for anything meaningful. And yet here he is, actively engaged in something he would never explain to anyone else. That realization makes him pause. Not stop, just pause. And in that pause, a different feeling rises. Not strong, not dramatic. Just quiet awareness that he is not as indifferent as he wants to believe. He puts the phone down again, turns onto his side, stares at the dark room, and for a while, nothing happens. Then something does. A memory surfaces, not of a big moment, but something almost insignificant. Her voice saying something casual, a phrase he wouldn't normally remember, and suddenly it feels too clear, too present, like it's happening again instead of being remembered. His body reacts slightly before his thoughts catch up. A small shift in breathing, a subtle tightening in his stomach. Not painful, just noticeable. And that's what makes it worse. Because it's not intense enough to justify, but it's not nothing either. So he does what he usually does with things that don't fit anywhere. He tries to move past it. He turns on his back, checks the phone again. Nothing new. Of course, there's nothing new. But the checking itself has become part of the rhythm now. And rhythms, once formed, are hard to interrupt even when they don't make sense anymore. There's also something else happening during these nights that he doesn't fully recognize yet. He starts constructing versions of conversations in his head. Not fantasies exactly, more like unfinished corrections. Things he wishes he had said differently. Things he wishes he had said at all. Sometimes he imagines her response. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes the imagined silence feels more real than any actual exchange. And he lies there negotiating with something that never actually happened out loud. It's exhausting in a quiet way. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from action, but from internal repetition. At one point, he catches himself holding his breath without realizing it. He exhales, then laughs slightly under his breath, not because anything is funny, but because of how absurd it feels to be this mentally occupied over something he keeps insisting is not that serious. That contradiction doesn't resolve either. It just sits there with everything else. There's a moment near the end of one of these nights where he almost reaches a decision. Not a big one, just a small impulse. Maybe I should message her. Not because he has something important to say. Not because there's urgency. Just because the silence has started to feel slightly too present. He opens the chat, types a word, stops, deletes it, starts again, stops again, and then he does something that feels almost automatic. He locks the phone and turns it over. Like physically removing access will settle the internal argument. But it doesn't. The argument continues without the screen. It just moves deeper. And in that deeper place, there's something he doesn't want to fully admit even to himself. He's not just thinking about her. He's tracking her absence. And that difference matters more than he wants it to. Because absence, once noticed, doesn't stay neutral. It starts becoming a presence of its own. He falls asleep eventually, not because anything resolves, but because exhaustion wins the argument that awareness can't finish. And even then, part of him keeps thinking in fragments as he drifts off. Her name, her laugh, the last unread message, the space between them that is no longer empty, even if nothing is happening in it yet. He thinks he knows what to expect when he sees her again. That's the first mistake. Because, in his mind, time has been simple, a few days of distance, a few messages that didn't land quite the same, a quiet stretch of space that he labeled early as normal. Nothing dramatic, nothing unresolved. Just life. So, when the moment finally comes, and she's actually there in front of him again, he tells himself almost automatically that everything will fall back into place. It doesn't. Not in a visible way. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But something inside him doesn't sync properly. It's subtle at first. He hears her voice, and it feels slightly closer than he expected. Not emotionally, physically, like the sound hits him before he's prepared for it. He nods, smiles, responds. All normal. But there's a delay somewhere between his internal state and his external behavior. A small lag, like two versions of him loading at different speeds. She laughs at something someone says, and he laughs to maybe a second too late, maybe a second too measured. He can't tell anymore. And while everything looks fine from the outside, inside him there's a strange sensation he doesn't have language for yet. Not anxiety, not excitement, something closer to mismatch, as if his presence and his awareness are not fully in the same room. At one point, she turns slightly toward him while speaking. It's casual, nothing heavy, just a natural moment of attention. And his body reacts before his thoughts catch up. He straightens slightly, not consciously, just adjustment, a subtle recalibration of posture, tone, awareness. And immediately after that, he notices himself noticing it, which makes it worse, because now he is aware that he is being aware, and that loop pulls him slightly out of the moment. He keeps talking anyway, keeps functioning, but something in him is split. One part is participating, the other part is watching. There is a moment later where they're sitting closer than usual, not intentionally intimate, just proximity shaped by circumstance. And he becomes strangely aware of small things he never would have noticed before. The sound of her breathing between sentences, the way she shifts slightly before she speaks, the pause she takes when she's thinking but doesn't want to interrupt the rhythm of conversation. None of these things are dramatic, but they are specific, and specificity is what makes them stick. He tells himself to relax. He literally thinks it. Relax, as if it's that simple. But his body doesn't fully comply. Instead, it behaves like it's in a state of quiet alertness. Not tense, just responsive. Too responsive. At one point, their hands almost touch nothing intentional, nothing charged, but the near contact registers in him like a small interruption. He notices it too late to react, and that makes him notice it more. And now the moment exists twice. Once in reality, once in his awareness of it. And the second version is the one that lingers. He smiles at something she says, but afterward he can't fully remember what the conversation was about. Not because he wasn't listening, but because part of his attention was elsewhere the entire time. Tracking, adjusting, managing something he doesn't want to name. There is a strange contradiction building inside him during this interaction. He wants closeness. That part is obvious, even if he refuses to define it that way. But at the same time, closeness feels slightly destabilizing now that it's actually available, because it removes the distance he has been using to understand his own feelings. And without distance, everything becomes less structured, less predictable, more real. That's what unsettles him. Not her, not the situation, but the immediacy of it. At one point, she asks him something simple, something he should be able to answer without thinking. And he does answer, but he notices a fraction of hesitation before the words come out. Not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for him to register internally. And that tiny hesitation feels louder than the sentence itself. Later, when the conversation shifts away from him, he feels something unexpected. Not relief, not discomfort, just a slight drop in internal pressure he didn't realize was building. And that realization confuses him, because why would there be pressure in the first place? He starts questioning his own reactions in real time, which makes him even less present. He catches himself watching her while pretending not to watch her, then immediately corrects that behavior, then wonders why he corrected it, then stops wondering altogether, because thinking about it too deeply while it's happening feels dangerous in a way he can't justify. At some point, there's a pause in the group conversation. Not awkward, just natural silence between topics. And in that silence, he becomes suddenly aware of her again, not as an idea, as presence. And something in him tightens slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. Like his system is acknowledging something it doesn't know how to process in real time. He looks away first, not dramatically, just enough to reset his internal state. And that small action becomes its own kind of message to himself. Stay normal. Keep it contained. Don't read too much into this. But the problem is, he already is reading into it, even while trying not to. After the interaction ends, After they separate and move into different spaces again, something changes in him that he doesn't immediately notice. It's not emotional in an obvious way. It's physical first. A slight fatigue. A low, quiet drop in energy that doesn't match the effort he thinks he made. He sits somewhere alone afterward, doesn't matter where, and exhales like something just finished that he didn't realize he was part of. And then the mind starts catching up, replaying small fragments. Her tone, her timing, his own reactions. Moments where he felt slightly too aware of himself. Moments where he wasn't sure if he was acting naturally or managing perception. And with each replay, something uncomfortable grows. The realization that he was not fully present, even though he appeared to be. He opens his phone without thinking, stares at it, doesn't type anything, locks it again, and sits back slightly as if trying to reset something internal. But nothing resets. Instead, a quieter thought appears underneath everything else. Being around her feels different now, and he doesn't know when that happened, or what exactly changed. Only that something has shifted from simple interaction into something he can no longer experience without self-awareness interfering. And the interference, that's what stays with him long after the moment is gone. He doesn't call it avoidance. Not at first. In fact, if you asked him during this phase, he would probably laugh a little and explain it very calmly. I've just got a lot going on. And it sounds reasonable. It even is reasonable. That's what makes it dangerous. Because nothing about it looks like escape from the outside. It looks like maturity, like balance, like someone getting his life in order. But inside, something else is happening that he doesn't fully acknowledge. It starts with small adjustments in timing. He replies a little later than before, not dramatically, not in a way that would raise questions. Just enough delay so that he feels slightly more in control of the interaction. He tells himself it's normal. People get busy. People don't need to respond immediately. And he believes that, at least on the surface. But there's another layer underneath that he doesn't say out loud. Immediate response feels too exposed now. Like it reveals something he hasn't fully defined yet. So he waits. Sometimes minutes. Sometimes hours. Sometimes longer than necessary, without realizing he's even doing it. And when he finally replies, there's often a subtle shift in tone. More measured. Less spontaneous. As if he is editing himself in real time before or anything even reaches the screen. There's a specific moment I keep coming back to. He opens her message, reads it, types a reply, stops halfway, deletes it, starts again, stops again. Not because he doesn't know what to say, but because too many versions of him want to say slightly different things, and none of them feel fully safe anymore. So he chooses the simplest version, the one that requires the least emotional risk, and sends that instead, then immediately puts the phone down like he's distancing himself from what he just created. But distance doesn't feel clean. It feels slightly tense now, like something is held at arm's length without fully letting go. He starts using phrases that sound practical but carry emotional weight he doesn't acknowledge. I'm just focusing on myself right now. I need to clear my head. I've got a lot of priorities at the moment. And again, none of these are lies. That's what makes them so effective. But the emotional truth underneath them is not about priorities. It's about containment. There is a part of him that starts reacting strongly to intensity, even mild intensity. A longer message from her feels heavier than it used to. A warm tone feels slightly too direct. A simple question carries more internal processing than it should. And instead of leaning in, he steps back a little. Not visibly, not dramatically, just internally. like he's adjusting distance so he doesn't have to feel too much at once. He notices something else too. When he delays responding, he feels a brief sense of control, but it's followed almost immediately by something less comfortable. A subtle awareness that he is now responsible for the silence he created. And that awareness doesn't sit well. So he distracts himself, opens other apps, starts doing things that don't require emotional presence. He becomes efficient at avoiding stillness, not because stillness is painful, but because stillness allows thoughts to form fully, and formed thoughts are harder to dismiss. There is a night where this becomes especially clear. He's lying in bed, phone nearby, screen lighting up occasionally with unrelated notifications. Her name isn't there at first, but his mind keeps circling anyway. Not in a dramatic way, just small returns, fragments, moments. Then the urge to check becomes stronger than usual. He opens their chat, scrolls, stops, scrolls again. Nothing new. Of course, nothing new. But he wasn't checking for newness. He was checking for presence. And absence now feels slightly more noticeable than before. He locks the phone, turns it over, tries to settle. But instead of settling, his mind starts constructing explanations again. She's probably busy too. That's fine. This is normal. But even as he thinks those sentences, something inside him doesn't fully accept them anymore. Because the pattern has started to change. She is responding differently too. Not cold, not distant, just matching his rhythm. And that matching creates its own discomfort. Because now the interaction is no longer pulling in one direction. It's mirroring. And mirrors are harder to ignore than movement. There's a moment during this phase where he catches himself feeling something he doesn't like naming. Relief when there is distance, but also unease when the distance becomes consistent. It's contradictory, and he doesn't resolve it. He just lives inside it. Sometimes he misses her, but the missing doesn't translate into action. It translates into hesitation. And hesitation becomes the dominant language of his behavior. He starts to notice how often he prepares messages he never sends. He writes them in his head, rewrites them, then deletes them before they even become real. Because sending them feels like reopening something he is trying to organize into silence. And silence, in his mind, starts to feel like stability. But it isn't stability. It's suspension. There's also a physical shift he doesn't immediately connect to emotional behavior. He feels slightly more tired after interactions with her. Not exhausted in a dramatic way. Just drained in a quiet, unexplainable sense. Like something in him is working harder than it should. So he starts spacing things out more. Not intentionally as strategy, but as instinct. Less frequent replies. Less immediate engagement, less emotional availability disguised as being busy. And the strange thing is, from the outside, he looks fine, functional, stable, even grounded. But internally, he is managing something he doesn't fully name. The discomfort of feeling too much without knowing how to hold it. There is a subtle moment that stays with him later. He sees her active somewhere online, present, living her own rhythm without him. And instead of feeling curiosity or connection, he feels a small, unexpected emptiness. Not jealousy, not sadness, just a quiet awareness. She continues without needing the interaction the way he thought she might. And that realization lands differently than expected. He tells himself he's okay with it. And maybe he is. But something in him shifts slightly after that. A recalibration. Less reaching. More restraint. And restraint, once established, starts to feel like identity rather than choice. At the end of one of these nights, He lies in bed again, phone turnover, mind still active in the background. And there's a moment very quiet, almost invisible, where he thinks, I'm probably just overthinking this. But even that thought feels less convincing than it used to, because overthinking implies excess. And what he is starting to feel doesn't feel like excess. It feels like something that is changing shape without permission. So he stays where he is, not moving forward, not fully stepping back, just existing in the space between explanation and avoidance, and calling it busy, even as something in him begins to understand it's not about time at all anymore. At first, he thinks it's what he wanted. The silence, the space, the absence of constant checking, replying, adjusting, thinking ahead to what comes next. He even feels a brief relief when it begins, like something unclenched inside him without permission. No notifications pulling at him, no message he needs to interpret, no emotional timing to manage. Just quiet. And for a short while, it feels like balance returning. He tells himself this is good, healthy even. This is what I needed. But silence has a strange way of changing shape after it settles. It doesn't stay empty. It starts to feel structured. And then, slowly, it starts to feel noticed. The first few days, he doesn't really think about it. He keeps busy, or at least he tries to. Work, scroll, conversations that don't go too deep, music in the background that fills space but doesn't touch anything. And still, somewhere underneath it all, there's a low awareness that something has shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a gap where something used to be. At night, especially, it becomes clearer. He reaches for his phone out of habit, not consciously, just muscle memory. And then he stops, because there's nothing there. Or rather, there's nothing new there. No reason to open anything. No reason to check. And that absence feels slightly unfamiliar. Not peaceful, just unfamiliar. He lies back down, stares at the ceiling, waits for sleep. But sleep doesn't come immediately anymore, because his mind has started filling the space that silence created. At first, it's subtle, random fragments. Her voice in a half-remembered sentence. The timing of her laugh in a conversation that doesn't exist in the present moment anymore. The way she paused before answering something simple. And then the fragments become more organized. Not memories exactly. More like patterns replaying themselves without permission. He tells himself not to think about it. But that instruction doesn't work very well anymore, because there's nothing competing with it. During the day, distraction used to be enough. Now, even distraction feels slightly thinner. And that's when the checking begins again. Not because there is anything to check, but because checking has become part of how his mind regulates uncertainty. He opens their chat, stares at it, scrawls slightly, closes it, opens it again a few minutes later. Same result. Nothing new. And yet he keeps doing it, as if repetition might eventually produce change. Our meaning, our relief. But it doesn't. It only reinforces awareness. There is a moment he notices himself waiting for something without naming it. Not a message exactly. Not even contact. Just a sign of continuation. Proof that nothing has ended in a way he didn't consciously agree to. And that thought makes him uncomfortable, so he tries to dismiss it. But dismissal doesn't erase awareness. It just pushes it slightly deeper, where it becomes quieter, but more persistent. He starts noticing her absence in specific ways. Not emotional declarations, just small interruptions in routine perception. He sees something funny and thinks of sending it to her, then remembers he doesn't do that anymore. He hears a song and realizes he no longer associates it with any response from her. He opens his phone to share something and stops halfway through without fully deciding why. These micro pauses accumulate, and they start building a different kind of presence. Absence as structure. He doesn't call it loneliness. That would be too direct, too simple. Instead, it feels like adjustment. Like his internal rhythm is still sensing to a version of interaction that no longer exists in real time. And that mismatch creates a subtle tension he carries throughout the day. He starts noticing something else too. When something good happens, he doesn't immediately think of telling her anymore. But the thought still forms for half a second before disappearing. And that half second matters more than he wants to admit, because it shows the habit is still alive, just no longer expressed. There's a specific afternoon where this becomes more obvious. He's walking somewhere ordinary, nothing important happening. People moving around him, noise, light, the usual texture of the day. And suddenly, without warning, he feels a drop in energy. Not emotional collapse, just a quiet internal shift. Like something briefly aligned itself inside him and then didn't. And he realizes, in a way he can't fully ignore, that the silence is no longer neutral. It is active. It is doing something to him. He stops for a moment, looks at his phone, opens it, closes it again without doing anything, and keeps walking. But the awareness doesn't leave. At night, it becomes more pronounced again. He lies down, phone nearby but unused, and instead of checking it repeatedly like before, he just stares at it occasionally, as if expecting it to do something on its own. It doesn't, and that nothing happening starts to feel louder than expected. There's an internal conversation that begins forming during these nights. Not fully spoken, not organized, just fragments. It's fine. It's just space. People move on like this. But why does it feel like something is still happening? Silence responds with nothing, and that lack of response becomes its own kind of answer. He starts to feel something he doesn't like naming. The absence is not neutral. It is shaped. It carries weight. Not emotional weight in the dramatic sense, but structural weight. Like a space that used to be occupied still holds the outline of what was there, and his mind keeps interacting with that outline, even when nothing is actually happening. There's a moment where he almost reaches out, not impulsively, not dramatically, just a quiet internal impulse. Maybe I should say something. He opens the chat, types a word, stops, deletes it, stares at the screen a little longer than usual, and then locks the phone. But this time, instead of feeling relief, he feels something more complicated. Not regret, not satisfaction, just awareness that even silence is now a decision he is actively maintaining. And that realization changes how silence feels, because it is no longer something that happened to him. It is something he is participating in, and participation carries responsibility. He lies back down again, but sleep is delayed, not because of anxiety, not because of longing, but because his mind has begun tracking absence the way it once tracked presence. And that shift is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly redefines the space where her presence used to be. And in that redefined space, he starts to understand something he hasn't fully accepted yet. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means something is still there without moving. It usually doesn't start with intention. That's the part that makes it harder to explain later. There's no decision like, I'm going to message her tonight. It's more like a slow build of restlessness that doesn't have anywhere to go. a kind of mental pacing that happens while everything else is still. He's lying down, phone somewhere near his hand, screen dimming, and waking up with small movements he doesn't fully notice anymore. The night is quiet in the way nights get quiet when there's nothing urgent left to do. No conversations waiting. No tasks pulling at him. Just space. And that space, for some reason, doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels occupied. Not by anything visible. By awareness. He scrolls a little without meaning to. Stops. Locks the phone. And locks it again a minute later. He tells himself it's nothing. Just habit. But habits don't usually come with this level of internal friction. Something is building underneath the repetition. Not urgency exactly. Not emotion in a clean form. Just pressure. He turns on his side. Stares at the ceiling for a while. Then, almost without thinking, he opens their chat. Her name appears at the top, and that alone creates a slight shift in his chest that he doesn't fully acknowledge. He doesn't type anything yet, just looks, scrawls a little, stops on a message he's already read before, reads it again, not for information, for presence. There is a difference he's starting to notice, but doesn't know how to articulate. Reading old messages isn't about remembering what was said. It's about confirming that something once existed in a form that felt more direct than this current silence. He exhales slowly, then locks the phone, and that should be the end of it. But it isn't. A few minutes pass. He turns again, and locks the phone, opens the chat again. This time he starts typing. Just a word, then stops, deletes it. He stares at the blinking cursor for a moment longer than necessary. And in that moment, there's a split inside him that feels sharper than usual. One part says it's simple. Just send something. Anything. No need to overthink. The other part doesn't argue. It just resists. Not loudly. Not logically. More like a subtle tightening in the background of his awareness. A sense that sending a message would collapse something he has been carefully keeping suspended. He doesn't know what that something is. He only knows that it feels delicate now. So he exits the chat again, locks the phone, places it face down as if physical distance might help internal clarity. But clarity doesn't arrive. Instead, the silence around him feels different now. Not peaceful. Not neutral. More like it's waiting for him to do something he hasn't done yet. He shifts slightly in bed, adjusts position, tries to relax, but his body doesn't fully follow the instruction. There is a faint restlessness in his chest that doesn't rise to the level of anxiety, but refuses to disappear. And then the thoughts begin to loop again. Not loud thoughts. Quiet ones. She's probably asleep. Maybe it's too late. If I message now, it'll look random. But why does it matter how it looks? That last question doesn't resolve. It just hangs there. He opens the phone again. This time not immediately go into the chat. He scrolls through other things first, pretending to delay what he already knows he might do. Then eventually he opens it again. Her name. Still there. Still unchanged. And something about that continuity feels slightly disorienting. Because internally, everything has been shifting. But externally, nothing reflects it. He types again. This time more than one word. Stops halfway. Deletes it. Starts over. And somewhere in that process, he becomes aware of something uncomfortable. He is not writing a message. He is negotiating with himself. And neither side is winning. There is a moment where he pauses and actually puts the phone down. Just for a few seconds. As if stepping away might reset something. He turns onto his back. stares at the ceiling again, and there's a small internal argument that forms without invitation. You don't need to do this. Then why does it feel like I do? You're overthinking, or I'm just not ignoring it anymore. Silence responds to neither side. It just stays. After a while, he picks the phone up again, but slower this time. Less automatic, more aware of the choice itself. He opens the chat, types a sentence. It's simple. Something like, "Hey." He stares at it. It feels too small to matter, but also too loaded to send casually. And that contradiction is where he gets stuck, because neither option feels clean anymore. Sending it feels like opening a door he has been holding shut without realizing it. Not sending it feels like acknowledging that the impulse exists, but choosing to leave it unresolved again. He leans back slightly, runs a hand over his face. Not frustrated exactly, just caught in a loop he can't easily step out of. At some point, he deletes the message. Not because he changed his mind, but because keeping it there feels like holding a decision in suspension indefinitely. He locks the phone, turns it over again, and lies still. But stillness doesn't help, because now the message exists in his awareness even without being sent. And that's worse in a way, because now there's no action attached to it, only intention. And intention without execution becomes its own kind of pressure. He starts thinking about what would happen if he actually sent it. Not romantically, not dramatically, just practically. Would she reply quickly? Would she reply at all? Would it change the rhythm they've fallen into? And most importantly, would it make him feel something he is not prepared to handle right now? He doesn't answer those questions. He just circles them, again and again. Eventually, he sits up slightly, looks at the phone one more time, opens it, and instead of typing anything, he scrolls through their previous messages, back and forth, like he's searching for something he can't name, a justification, a timing, a version of himself that would make this easier. But none of it appears, and that absence becomes its own answer. He locks the phone again, this time more firmly, places it out of reach, as if distance could restore control. But even without the phone, the conversation continues in his mind. Not spoken, not resolved, just suspended. And as he finally lies back down, he realizes something quietly uncomfortable. The reason he almost reached out wasn't urgency. It wasn't necessity. It wasn't even clarity. It was simply that silence has started to feel like participation. And participation, even without action, is no longer something he can fully step away from. It doesn't happen in a dramatic way. No confrontation, no announcement, no clear ending. Just a moment that passes through his attention like something ordinary until it isn't. He sees something about her moving forward. It could be a post, a photo, a mention from someone else. It doesn't really matter what exactly it is. What matters is the timing of how it lands inside him. At first, there's no immediate reaction. That's the strange part. He just looks at it. Neutral face, neutral breath, neutral thought. And for a few seconds, it feels like nothing at all. Then something shifts underneath that surface neutrality. Not sharply, not emotionally loud. Just a quiet reorganization of something internal that he can't quite locate. It's like his mind recognizes a fact before he is ready to interpret it. She is not paused. She is not waiting. She is continuing, without him in the center of that continuation. He scrolls past it, then stops, then scrolls back up again. Not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because understanding and accepting are two different processes. and only one of them has completed. He leans back slightly, looks at the screen longer than necessary, and there it is. A feeling he doesn't immediately name. Not jealousy, not sadness in the way people usually describe it. Something more fragmented than that. A mixture that doesn't resolve cleanly into anything recognizable. There is a small tightening in his chest, then a strange lightness in his stomach, then nothing, then something again. It doesn't settle. He locks the phone, but the image doesn't disappear. That's the part he doesn't expect, because he's used to things fading once he stops looking at them. But this doesn't fade. It stays. Not visually, mentally. Like a piece of information his system keeps reprocessing without permission. He starts walking without fully deciding to. Just movement. Automatic. And while he walks, his mind keeps returning to the same simple fact. She is okay without him being actively present in her orbit. That sentence doesn't feel dramatic. It feels factual. And somehow, that makes it harder to process. Because if it were emotional drama, he could dismiss it. But this is just reality continuing. He finds himself thinking back through small fragments he didn't assign meaning to at the time. The times she replied slower. The moments she seemed slightly more distant. The gradual shift he labeled as normal busy life. And now those memories rearrange themselves with a different interpretation. Not as evidence of rejection. Not as proof of anything. Just as indicators that she was already moving in a direction he hadn't fully registered. He stops walking for a second. Stands somewhere without noticing the details of where he is. And there's a thought that starts forming, then stops halfway. Something like, so what was I expecting? He doesn't finish it. Because finishing it would require acknowledging something uncomfortable. That he assumed continuity, without confirming it. There is another layer underneath that he doesn't fully admit yet. Part of him expected his absence to create more impact than it did. Not consciously, not in an ego-driven way he would recognize easily, but in a quiet, unspoken assumption that emotional gravity works both ways equally. And seeing that assumption not reflected back at him creates a strange disorientation. He starts doing something he doesn't notice immediately. He replays old interactions in his mind, not to relive them, but to reevaluate them, looking for signals he might have misread, looking for moments where distance began forming before he acknowledged it. And with each replay, something subtle changes. The memories feel less certain than they used to, not because they are unclear, but because his interpretation of them is no longer stable. He sits somewhere eventually, doesn't matter where, phone in hand again. He opens it without thinking, checks her space again. Nothing new. Of course, nothing new. But now nothing new feels different. It feels like continuation without reference to him. And that creates a quiet discomfort he doesn't have a clear response to. He locks the phone again, then unlocks it again almost immediately. Not to look at her specifically, just to interrupt the feeling of uncertainty. But interruption doesn't work the same way anymore. Because now the feeling is not tied to one action. It is distributed. There's a moment where he catches himself imagining what she might be doing right now. Not in a romanticized way. Just simple projection. She is somewhere, talking to someone, living a moment that doesn't include him in any active sense. And instead of that thought being distant, it feels oddly close. Too close. He exhales slowly, looks down at the phone, then away from it, then back again. And there's a strange contradiction building inside him that he doesn't resolve. He doesn't want to interfere with her life, But he also didn't fully expect her life to feel so complete without his participation. And that gap between expectation and reality is where the discomfort lives. He starts telling himself things. People move on. This is normal. I shouldn't overthink it. But none of those sentences land fully anymore. Because this isn't about logic. It's about position. Where he thought he stood in the structure of things and where he actually stands. There's a memory that surfaces unexpectedly. A small moment from earlier in the connection. Something casual. Her laughing at something he said. Not important in itself. But now it feels like it belonged to a different version of reality. One where he assumed proximity meant permanence. He rubs his face slightly. Not out of frustration exactly. More like trying to reset something internal that doesn't respond to physical gestures. Later that day, he finds himself checking his phone more than usual again. Not out of hope. Not out of expectation. But out of habit, trying to resolve a feeling that doesn't resolve through checking. And each time he opens it, there is nothing new. And each time, that absence feels slightly more structured. Like it is no longer neutral space. It is defined space. At one point, he puts the phone down and just sits still. No distraction. No movement. And in that stillness, something becomes clear in a way he doesn't fully welcome. The feeling he is dealing with is not loss in the dramatic sense. It is reorientation. And reorientation always comes with discomfort, because it requires updating something internal that has already been emotionally assumed. He exhales again, looks at nothing in particular, and for the first time, there is a thought that doesn't try to soften itself. She is not coming back into the same version of this I was still holding onto. He doesn't say it out loud. He doesn't fully accept it either, but it's there now. And once it appears, it doesn't leave easily. It just waits. Like everything else in this story that never needed to be allowed to become real, it doesn't arrive like a revelation. There's no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. No emotional collapse that feels cinematic or final. It's quieter than that, almost disappointing in how ordinary it feels. He notices it on a random day that doesn't stand out from any other day. He's doing something simple, something his mind doesn't even fully register as important, and then, without warning, there's a brief pause inside him. Not in the world. Inside him. A small internal stillness that doesn't ask permission. And in that stillness, something becomes visible. Not new. Just finally undeniable. He understands. Not emotionally first. Not dramatically. Just cognitively. Like a fact that has been circulating in the background finally steps into focus. He didn't lose her in a single moment. He didn't push her away in a clear, defined action. It happened through accumulation, through delay, through silence, through small decisions that never felt like decisions at the time. And that realization doesn't come with relief. It comes with weight. Because understanding it now doesn't change what it already became. He sits somewhere, doesn't matter where, and he doesn't reach for his phone immediately. That's new. The habit is still there, but it hesitates now before activating. Like a reflex that has started to lose urgency. He still opens it eventually. Of course he does. But when he looks, there is nothing that pulls him in the same way anymore. Not because something changed externally, but because something inside him has already shifted its position. He scrolls without meaning to. Stops. Closes it again. And this time, the action feels less like searching and more like acknowledgement. There's a strange emptiness in it. Not painful in the way he expected emptiness to feel. Just settled. Like a space that has stopped pretending is temporary. He leans back slightly, and for the first time, he doesn't immediately fill the silence with distraction. He just lets it exist. And in that silence, memories start arriving differently, not as emotional waves, but as facts with emotional residue attached. Her laugh, her pauses, the way she used to respond quickly at first, the way that changed slowly, the way he explained it away each time. Busy, life, timing, all of it now looks slightly different when viewed from here. Not wrong, just incomplete. And incompleteness has a way of becoming clearly after it's too late to correct it. There's no dramatic regret. That's important. It's not the kind of regret that demands action. It's the kind that arrives after action is no longer relevant. A quieter version, one that just sits there, observing. He exhales, longer than usual, and there's a thought that forms without resistance. I was still thinking it would stabilize on its own. He doesn't judge it. He doesn't argue with it. He just notices how true it feels now in a way it didn't feel before. Because at the time, nothing seemed broken enough to fix. And now, nothing feels broken in a way that can be fixed. That difference matters more than anything else. He looks at his phone again. But this time, there's no urgency behind the motion. No expectation. Just familiarity. He opens their chat. Scrawls a little. Stops on old messages. Reads them without searching for meaning. And something strange happens. The messages feel like they belong to a version of him that was still assuming continuation. Not love. Not fate. Just continuation. And that assumption feels like the real turning point now. Not the distance. Not the silence. But the belief that nothing needed active maintenance. He closes the chat, places the phone down, and lets it stay there for a while. No immediate reach back. No reflex checking. Just stillness. And in that stillness, another realization appears, but softer this time. He didn't lose her in the way he imagined loss happens. He let the rhythm fade without noticing it was becoming a rhythm. There's a difference. And that difference is uncomfortable because it doesn't allow him to place responsibility anywhere simple. Not on her. Not entirely on himself. Just on the process that neither of them interrupted in time. Later, he finds himself thinking about the night he almost reached out. He remembers how close it felt. How real the impulse was. How many times he started and stopped. And now, from this distance, that moment feels like a threshold he stood at without fully understanding it was a threshold. He exhales again. Slightly sharper this time. Not emotional. Just recognition. There's also something else he notices now. The absence doesn't hurt in waves anymore. It doesn't arrive and leave. It is just there in the background, like something that has been integrated into the structure of his awareness. And that might be the most unsettling part, because it means there's nothing actively happening anymore. No conflict to resolve. No message to send. No timing to fix. Just consequence settling into form. He stands up eventually, moves round a bit, does something ordinary, and still the realization follows him without effort. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. And at some point, he catches himself thinking something very simple. She didn't wait for me to become ready. He pauses after that thought, not because it hurts, but because it finally aligns everything that didn't make sense before. And he realizes something he doesn't say out loud. He was never dealing with a sudden ending. He was moving through a slow disappearance he didn't recognize until it was already complete. Later that night, he picks up his phone one last time, opens it, looks, closes it again. No message is written. No attempt is made. And for the first time, the absence of action doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like acceptance arriving after everything else has already finished speaking. He sets the phone down, turns away, and lies still. Not because he is healed, not because he has clarity, but because there's nothing left to chase in the same way anymore. And somewhere in that stillness, he finally understands the simplest truth of all. It wasn't one moment that ended it. It was all the moments he didn't realize were becoming distance.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.